Okay, welcome back. Let's look some more at plastic. If we're going to look at how plastic affected design, we have to start in Italy. And there are a few reasons. The first is that there are craft traditions in Italy that are ancient. And making molds for plastics, especially in the early days, involved a lot of craftsmanship. In America, there was a reticence to take on complexity in mold making because it adds expense. In Italy, there was a pride in that. So objects that might require a complicated multi-part mold weren't out of the question in Italy. Another reason is that by the mid to late 1950s, much of Europe was coming back online after the war. Rebuilding had happened, infrastructure was being repaired, manufacturing was getting back up to speed. So for the first time in 10 years, Europe was ready to get going. This is a plastic pail designed by Gino Colombini and made by Cartel, and I included the patent drawing just so you could take a moment to appreciate how the handle is attached. The plastic is molded with a knob that the metal handle can then wrap around. And that's a great example of taking advantage of what plastic can do well. It's molded with variable wall thickness and there's a flexibility so it can be squeezed through the opening in the wire. A man named Giulio Natta invented polypropylene in 1953, laboratory invention. Giulio Costello had studied with him and was there right at the beginning of the use of polypropylene, and he founded a company called Cartel in 1949. Cartel made housewares in this new material, and Gino Colombini was brought in as the technical director of Cartel starting in 1949. So all the early items that Cartel produced were trying to use plastic to make humble, inexpensive housewares, and Gino Colombini designed them. There are some really clever investigations of plastic. Before we had the ability to co-mold multiple plastics together, Cartel was using different plastics for their different strengths. This is a flexible tub or bucket that then also has a rim with handles that's more rigid that fits around it, so you can combine them to get the benefits of the flexibility of a tub and the rigidity you would want to carry it around. The objects that Cartel was making were, in a really clever way, investigating where plastic could be useful. And they're really interesting combinations of form coming out of that investigation. You could say that the two rug beaters on the left are an investigation of a space-age, atomic sort of aesthetic, but you could also look at it as an investigation in plastic flowing through a mold. How can you get the plastic to flow all the way through the mold? Where will the vents and sprues go? How can you make something with a comfortable handle and a rigid stem and then flexible beaters at the end, but have it be all one part? With the benefit of the rear view mirror and some experience, we probably all know that a molded plastic dish drainer is not the right answer. But it's a really good answer if your goal is to investigate plastic molding. How thin can the fins be before they lose structural integrity? How can you make structure to hold up as many dishes as possible without using too much material? And the strainer on the lower right is a really brilliant investigation of perforations, shaping the mold so there's enough connectivity for the plastic to flow through, but enough openings for it to function as a strainer, and having that all happen as one action is really exciting. If you were making this in metal, you'd have to take a disc of sheet metal and punch the holes in it and then stretch it or spin it or stamp it into shape, and then roll the edge and then add handles. In plastic, you can make the whole thing in one part. Colombini began exploring the advantages of plastic. It's colored. It's not painted after, the whole thing is colored all the way through. So how can you use that color in an exciting way? And the colors that were available were inherently exciting. And he also pushed the limits of what form could do. The juicer on the top is a crazy hybrid of lots of different functions and shapes. The cup is shaped so you can grip it well with your hand. The lid on top has finger grips so that you can grip it and rotate it. On the inside there are sharp spikes to grip the pulp of the fruit. And there are perforations to allow the juice through while straining out the seeds and the fibers. And then on the inside of the lid are ridges that grip the fruit. So each surface of this has a completely different texture that's allowing a different aspect of how this thing would work. But in the end, it's one yellow, exciting, unified sculptural shape. One of the challenges in making things in plastic is to keep the mold size small, to keep costs down. So the standing dustpan on the bottom is not one piece, it's actually two pieces. The handle snaps into the base with a snap fit that's molded right in. So in the end, it looks like one sculptural form, but it's actually made in two parts. Plastic began to prove itself useful in new places as well. It can be highly chemically resistant, and Cartel launched a new range from 1959 on of laboratory wear. Plastic created things that were shiny and colorful. The material had a new aesthetic of its own, and designers started to play with how to use that with intent. and lots of designers did so. Again, scale was one of the biggest challenges at this point, so a lot of early plastic housewares are modular. Anna Castelli-Ferrari produced a modular storage system that took advantage of this idea. Even though these things are very large moldings, they could be assembled, stacked into even larger furniture. As an FYI, Anna Castelli-Ferrari was one of the first women to graduate from Milan Polytechnic Institute in 1943 with an architecture degree. And in 1949, she was there with her husband, Giulio Castelli, founding Cartel. It became one of the leading furniture companies known for high-end quality plastic designs. And as with Knoll, a lot of Cartel's success rested on Anna Castelli-Ferrari's understanding of how to use design and work with designers. She also designed a number of things on her own, many of which were successful. On the right is her polo stool, which is from later, but I just wanted you to see a little bit more of her work. Designers gradually figured out that plastic wouldn't work well in imitation of other forms. It also wouldn't work well if you thought about creating structures that worked in other materials. You couldn't treat it like metal or wood. So designers really started to explore what they could make out of plastic that took advantage of its own abilities and the shapes that it wanted to make. There was a rapid shift from humble utilitarian objects like buckets to artistic sculptural things, many of which put exploration above function. Do we need these things? No. Do we want them? Yes. Joe Colombo also designed for Cartel, but this is the Bobby portable storage system he did for Biefplast. This is another example of smart modular thinking. The cart is quite large, and I know it's difficult to see in these images, but there are many smaller parts snapped together. So each of the rotating drawers is the same, that's one mold. The side storage bins are used the same 3 times. That's one other part used and repeat. The shelves are used and repeat, and the whole thing is designed to snap together. So as with Castelli-Ferrari's modular units, you could assemble them in different ways and have short ones or tall ones. We started to see plastic migrate from high-end Italian design statements to normal everyday objects that were affordable and ubiquitous. There's no better example of that than Massimo and Leila Vignelli's plastic tableware. It was first created in 1964 as a piece of high-end Italian design. And then American manufacturer and distributor Robert Heller saw it and decided that he wanted to try and introduce it in the United States. At first he imported it. It was made still in Italy. And then he ended up buying the molds and bringing them to America. And then he ended up making new molds as the line became ever more popular. When I say this was everywhere in the 1970s, I mean it was everywhere. The only thing that distinguished our house from our neighbor's house when I was a kid was that we had orange and they had white, but everybody had this. The Max line is still in production today. Mugs cost about $9. And although the forms are almost the same as the original 1964 design, there were many changes made along the way. The set was originally designed to stack onto one tray, so you'd have everything you needed for service for 4, small bowls, large bowls, plates, serving container, and it was all modular and stackable. That modularity and stackability stayed, but the pieces changed and the colors certainly changed. Because I pretend I'm teaching design history, but really I only want to help you do better at yard sales, I want to mention that 99.9% of the Max mugs that you will see in the world have a little wall where the vertical cylinder and the half cylinder that's bent around to make the handle join. And that's a really important detail. The original mugs did not have that. The Vignellis, being architects and designers, originally created this with a purity of concept, where one cylinder turned into the other cylinder, where it was one unified shape, not a handle stuck on a cylinder. But of course, when that came to America, the first thing we did was fill it with hot coffee and somehow decide to tip it backwards, channeling the hot coffee out of the mug and right onto our arm. So it had to be redesigned with that little wall there. So if you ever see one of these in a store or at a yard sale without that little wall, snap it up, because those are rare and it will be valuable. I think this is a really instructive comparison. On the left are the Vignelli and Heller dishes, which, although designed in '64, really found maturity in distribution in America in 1970. And on the right, Russell Wright's residential melamine ware from 1953. They were designed only 10 years apart and in active distribution 20 years later, but they're almost unrecognizably different otherwise, and they're made of the same material. These are all made of melamine. A lot of designers around the world began playing with plastic for stylish, new, designed housewares. Karlin Breger was a Swedish designer whose biography at least says he designed over 3,000 objects from the 1950s on. He had studied ceramic design, porcelain design, and went to work at Gustavsberg, which was a porcelain factory, right at the time when plastic was arriving as an opportunity for manufacturers, and Gustavsberg was interested in exploring that. He worked there from 1953 to 1957 and was really instrumental in helping them switch into plastic and investigate where it could go. The things he made for them were fancier, a little higher end. But he also kept designing in plastics, designing many everyday objects all the way through the 1970s, including the well-known Flora margarine tub. Plastics began to transform other areas as well, not just housewares. Less style-focused areas like packaging and distribution started to be reimagined with the addition of plastic. Plastic is perfect for transporting volatile liquids, and in the case of the gasoline container on the left, the handle is molded right in. That's a feature we're familiar with in our world. But that's a pretty remarkable accomplishment. This uses blow molding, so if you remember the video I showed you earlier, it's a tube that's clamped in a mold and air expands the plastic against the surface of that mold. In this case, the mold closes off under the finger grip as well. So the handle is molded in at the same time. And if you've ever picked one of these up when they're heavy, you know that the seam where that plastic has met is still present in the finger grips. This container also has shapes molded in the bottom, so these can stack vertically in a shipping container. Around the world in the 1950s and 60s, manufacturers were waking up to the possibilities of plastic, this sort of grainless wonder, the amazing surfaces and colors and shapes that they could investigate, and how the products they made might be transformed. If you add to that the addition of transistors, we start to see some really exciting transformations of objects that had been around for a while. The Eureka phone is a great example. Although you could have realized shapes like this in metal, this phone would have been way too heavy to pick up. This is a one-piece phone. Everything is contained in that one shape, and it needed to be light to make that happen. Transistors were used to produce the ringtone in place of a larger metal bell, so the whole thing could be smaller, and the plastic allowed this shape to function as the housing for the telephone equipment, the base, the earpiece, the mouthpiece, and also the handle, all in one form. Plastic allowed, or I would say even required, designers to reimagine and reinterpret and recreate everything we had made with new sculptural form language. This is a vacuum cleaner designed by Matsushita just as they were becoming Panasonic. They claim to have sold 630,000 of them, so on paper it was very successful. I've never seen one in person, so I don't know where they all were, and I don't know where they all are, but it's a really beautiful object. And you could argue that this shape is referencing automobiles. It's the mid-1960s, and it has chrome hubcaps, and it looks like it's speeding down the highway. But it's really smart housing work for a vacuum cleaner as well. The shape is molded in two halves, so you can assemble all of the insides of the vacuum cleaner and then just snap the casing on left and right. So as with the Eureka phone, this housing is lighter weight, easier to make, and it allows a new kind of shape to an existing product. If this conversation is about how new form opportunities and material possibilities allow better manufactured goods, the pinnacle of that exercise is Olof Bäckström's Fisker Scissors. This is a combination of form and material understanding plus rational design. For me, this gets all the things that were good about Braun design and all the things that we're going to look at as exciting about Italian design, and all of the excitement of mid-century organic form, and all of the interest in ergonomics from the 1940s wrapped up in one object. Scissors had had curved forms that fit the hand for a very long time, but made out of cast brass and quite heavy. Cast melamine is an elegant substitute for that, and it allowed the forms to become ever more exaggerated and exciting. Bäckström trained as a woodworker and did all of the modeling for the Fiskers in wood. I'm not sure why I feel I need to include that. I just think it's interesting. For years, I've wanted to know more about Olof Bäckström's work. Anyone who was able to create the Fisker Scissors, which are such a work of genius, must have left a long trail of success behind. In fact, there's very little I can show you. He went to work at Fisker specifically to try and help them find uses for plastic, and introduced the Fiskman houseware line in 1961. And there's nothing wrong with these designs. They're lovely. But they don't have the same kind of inevitable authority that the Fisker Scissors do. Plastic allowed, and I think actually kind of required, a considering of the ridiculous as well. So many shapes were possible that hadn't been possible before that people went just a teeny bit crazy. and the Tuda Loop radio is a great example of that. The ad said it's an S, it's an O, it's a crazy radio, it's a Tuda Loop. So the basic premise is that closed, you can wear it as a bracelet and carry it around, and then you twist it open and you have something that holds itself up and becomes tuner and speaker all at once in the exposed surfaces. In reality, it's much too large to wear as a bracelet. It's relatively heavy, but it's lots of fun, and it has stayed part of the canon of important and interesting design objects merely based on its ability to be colorful and funny looking. What we start seeing in the use of plastics is an abandonment of many of the things that had mattered in design. Forget ergonomics. We don't care if it matches the ear and the mouth the way Henry Dreyfuss insisted. What if it's fun? What if it's sculptural? Remember that in America, we had been using almost exclusively the same Henry Dreyfuss designed telephone for 20 years at this point. And because of some changes in the phone industry, phones were allowed to change as well. We started to get phones like the Sculptura phone that were way more about the visual statement than about the way they worked. You can't hold that on your shoulder. You can barely hold it in your hand. The base is unbelievably heavy. It's difficult to pick the whole thing up. It's a terrible design if function is your goal. It's a fantastic design if statement telephone is your goal. And the Griot phone, designed by Richard Sapper and Marco Zanuso, was named Grasshopper because the ring, which used a transistor, sounded like a cricket or grasshopper. It's a flip phone that pretends to fit in the hand well, and because it flips open, matches your ear and your mouth well. But I don't think anybody ever enjoyed using this phone for its ergonomics. Everyone enjoyed it for its amusing presence and the satisfaction of flipping it open when you answer it. There's some cultural stuff to keep in mind as we continue this investigation of plastic and forms. This is not a history class, and I am not a historian. So this will be, I think the technical term would be hella clumsy. But you need to keep this stuff in mind. There was a major shift happening at the same time that plastics were arriving. On the top row, we see some of the cultural indicators we associate with the 1950s. These were the boom years of the post-war era. In America especially, we had a really strong economy. Rebuilding from the war was happening around the world. There was huge corporate growth, and that started to age. The next generation, the generation that matured in the 1960s, found itself stifled by all of that home and family focus. The idea of women as little more than a mother or a housewife really didn't hold up to scrutiny all that well. Also, the promise of the 1950s, the American prosperity for all, started to matter less as other countries got their own economies going and could return to investigating their own style. The biggest change is that the children who grew up in the shadow of the 50s were offered a promise. If you behave well and you're good and you get married and you have 2.5 children and a car in the garage and you get a good job and stay there till you're dead, you'll be fine, you'll be happy, you'll be successful. They realized none of that was true. It was all a fiction. And so there was a major shifting of focus in the 1960s away from the traditional ideas about home, about career, about the sexes, about music, about culture, about self-expression. And we see that in evidence everywhere, in popular culture, in music, in design, in fashion, in everything. Also, as I mentioned earlier, London, France, Italy were devastated by the war, but by the 1960s were back up to full speed and ready to reassert themselves. So we see a major shift away from American culture and towards European culture. Here are some things that happened in 1968 that dramatically changed the world. And all of these things were televised, so people saw them in the comfort of their own living room, whether they were watching on a fancy future plastic television or a traditional old-style wooden housing television. In 1968, the Soviets invaded Prague, ending the Prague Spring. The picture on the upper left is tanks driving over people to do that. On the upper right is a Vietnamese general executing a handcuffed prisoner right in front of the NBC News cameras, so everyone saw that. On the lower left are the Chicago Democratic National Convention riots, which were televised. And on the lower right, the Paris student uprisings, all broadcast on television. Both Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King were assassinated in 1968, which led to riots all over the United States, televised. And also there were protests against the Vietnam War, there were marches for civil rights, and there were student uprisings in Mexico, where again tanks drove over students, all televised. As a result of all of this global turmoil and this really dramatic shift to a youth culture, to a new way of doing things, affected design. We start to see layers of social commentary involved in a lot of design, and because plastic is arriving at the same time, it tends to be expressed in plastic objects. This is the famous Valentine typewriter, designed by Ettore Sottsass and Perry King, created by Olivetti, the Italian typewriter maker. And this is clearly not your father's typewriter, right? This is not designed for office use. This is bright colors and plastic. It's portable. The handle is molded right into the back of the typewriter. It's designed to take on a picnic and write love letters or poetry, not to stay in an office and produce multiple copies of an invoice. Advances in technology, plus moldable, lighter weight plastic, allowed personal television, portable television. And I love the idea of people watching riots on the news in style with their portable television. These are irrational design. If you found the Brown design fussy or stuffy or boring or too rational or too regular, then this is for you. Both of these televisions are so full of personality and so animated. Just for contrast, here's a Sony portable television. It wasn't the first. The Philco Safari was the first, but that's not worth looking at. This is a fully transistorized television. It's formed and enameled metal. So it's really only here because it had a transistor in it and it was portable. But I think it makes a really nice comparison to the Italian portable televisions because it shows you how rapidly the technology was advancing, how useful plastic was in creating a new aesthetic, and also how difficult the struggle was to arrive at a hybrid between something that was engineered and could work and something that was designed and could also make an aesthetic statement of some kind. This was an expensive television. It cost $250. That's over $2,000 today. And portable radios were hardly new by the 1960s, but plastic allowed these radios to become statement radios. The marketing for the Marco Zanusso and Richard Sapper Brion Vega radio says that it is the protagonist of its environment. And imagine arriving at a picnic with friends with this mystery red rectangular pod, and then you open it up and it turns out to be a radio. Also look at the face on this radio and the speaker vent on this radio. This is so different from the Braun examples I showed you earlier, and it's not all that much later. It's much less concerned with the rationality of the placement and the ease of use of all of these knobs and dials. It's way more concerned with the visual statement that they're going to make. And that's even more true in these two radios. The miniaturization of the insides because of transistors and the addition of colorful, smooth plastics allowed electronic objects to become statement pieces. And suddenly designers didn't care if the vents and buttons were beautiful compositions. And designers didn't care if the dial was easy to read. These designers are saying something different with their work. This leads inevitably to the cult of the celebrity designer, which started in Italy with Memphis, and we'll look at that next week, but try and keep these radios in mind when we do that. Mario Bellini's record player for Minerva is only 13 years after the Wilhelm Wagenfeld Combi that I showed you that Braun made, and it's a completely different creature. It's amazing how quickly we mastered the equation of plastics and technology to make completely new forms out of existing products. This is really the first statement record player since the John Vassos chrome-plated and velvet Art Deco affair I showed you from 1939. Plastics allowed crazy new forms and opened the door to irrationalism in a lot of different ways. There's no better object to show you the sort of irrational fun that Italian designers had with plastic than the chair on the left, the blow chair. This is PVC sheet material used to make a high-end discursive design statement. The picture on the top is the chair in the MoMA's collection, and I think you can see the plastic has aged in a way that makes it a little bit less appealing than the promise of the chair you can see in the ads below from the time they were new. But there were also people making super low-end, available, affordable objects in the same material. The transparent umbrella was available and everywhere in the 1960s, and if this were a fashion history course, we would look at the many, many, many designers exploring transparent PVC in fashion. I want to focus more on the lower-end plastic use in designed objects, because while all the high-end, fancy Italian design was happening, plastic was really transforming the world of utilitarian objects. Tupperware is the best example of this. Tupperware took advantage of plastic's flexibility to transform food storage. In its earliest incarnation in 1946, Earl Tupper's plastic containers made of polyethylene might be considered more engineering than design, but he very quickly figured out how to add the right amount of color and the right amount of features and the right amount of marketing to transform food storage and many other things as well. Because there are 2 student presentations on Tupperware, I'm not going to spend more time on this, but anyone who doesn't have access to those, do some homework and learn about Brownie Wise, a woman who completely transformed Earl Tupper's prospects with her complete genius for understanding marketing. But certainly, most American households discovered plastic and how useful it could be through Tupperware. Another important early way that plastic was introduced to the world is through Lego. Ole Kirk Christensen was a carpenter in Denmark, and during the Depression, he had to find new ways to make money. He started making small wooden toys and renamed his company in 1934 Lego. After the war, he invested in plastic injection molding machines. He imported the very first one into Denmark, purchased from England. And by 1949, he was producing something called the automatic binding brick. Not the Legos we know today, but the precursors to that. A dirty little secret that Lego would love you to not know is that that injection molding machine arrived in Denmark with samples of what you could make with it to inspire you to be innovative. And one of the samples was Hilary Page's Kittycraft building bricks, made in England in 1947, 2 years earlier. So pretty much Christensen just copied those. That doesn't mean that Lego doesn't win the prize for doing this correctly, because Ole's son Gottfried completely redesigned those blocks in 1958 and added the hollow tubes underneath. This is a revolutionary but very small change because it expanded the number of combinations you could make with a set and allowed them to be connected in many, many more ways. There have been 440 billion Legos made since 1949, and it's estimated that there are over 60 bricks for every person on the planet. So if that's not a radical and dramatic introduction of plastic into our lives, I don't know what is. Anyone who's sat through this class with me all semester knows that I am begrudgingly showing you all the fancy things I'm supposed to show you, and everything in a book and in a museum collection. But I'm way more excited about the utilitarian things. Statement radios are nice, toys are fun, but everyday objects that we all use are the things that I think really can teach us more. Glass bottles, which were heavy and breakable, gave way to plastic bottles. Blow-molded polyethylene could be used for packaging. And in America anyway, I don't know about globally, but in America, the very first blow-molded polyethylene flexible plastic packaging was made for Stopette deodorant. I have the sound off on this commercial because it's hardly mission critical, but it is really amusing, so find that if you want to. But this really transformed what a deodorant could be. Before this, it was a cream in a pot that you applied manually. And now it's something that could be aspirated, sprayed on. The new kind of packaging allowed the product to develop in a new direction. And I don't know about you, but I'm kind of amazed by this. The flexible plastic lemon juice container is one of the earliest uses of extrusion blow molding in plastics for packaging. It's perfect for lemon juice, which is highly acidic because the plastic is resistant to corrosion. It can be molded with the texture and shape of a lemon, and you get an instantly iconic, understandable package. And the pink lawn flamingos have also been around forever, maybe as early as 1946, but in production as we know them since 1957. And these are made the same way with blow-molded plastic in a 2-part mold. But I think the biggest transformation that was allowed or even forced by the spread of plastic was not in the shape of a radio or television or the lightness of a vacuum cleaner, but in our own behavior. Plastic transformed many everyday experiences, and much of how we do things today, our behavior, was formed by the changes that utilitarian plastic items introduced into our lives. So something as simple as a vacuum-formed plastic coffee cup lid made taking coffee on the go possible. And I don't know many people in our world today that would volunteer to give that up and go back to a world where you went to a coffee shop and stayed there until you finished your coffee. But if you take a cardboard cup plus a plastic travel lid, you can get coffee on the go. And this is a method of manufacturing that wasn't in the videos I showed. This is a thin sheet of usually polystyrene that's heated up and forced down over a mold that has small holes and a vacuum below to suck the plastic around the mold. And then it's trimmed out after. Both Pepsi and Coke introduced lightweight plastic bottles in 1975, the Pepsi Plastishield and the Coke Easy Goer lightweight plastic bottle. I'm going to let this ad play for you. It's that good.
This is the new lightweight plastic 2-litre bottle. Easy Goer, for your Coca-Cola bottler. So light that 10 Easy Goer plastic bottles weigh less than one glass bottle. And And full, Easygoer weighs 25% less than a glass 2-litre bottle. Easier to carry home, easier to pour. And because Easygoer is plastic, it protects against life's hard knocks. It's light, it's tough. It's Easygoer.
I was alive when these came out. They're not unbreakable. In 1975, when these were introduced, the most common thing you would hear in supermarkets was, clean up in the drinks aisle, because everybody went to the store and decided to mimic this ad and drop them on the floor and see what would happen, and of course they broke. It took a long time to master the structure at the bottom and figure out how to make them truly unbreakable. Nevertheless, they were much lighter than glass and completely changed the availability of beverages. FYI, because I'm addicted to FYIs. Oh, I should call it the other thing. Wait, what do the kids say? For what it's worth. FWIW. FWIW. Nathaniel Wyeth, who was son of the illustrator N.C. Wyeth and brother to painter Andrew Wyeth, joined DuPont in 1936 as an engineer. And in 1967, he started investigating how to store soda in plastic bottles, and the patent for polyethylene soda bottles is in his name. Also quietly in the background, while all the high-profile designers made small quantities of fancy things that we've decided to remember in museums, there were thankless staff designers everywhere tackling how to really make good, functional, inexpensive housewares out of this new material. Charles Harrison is a great example. He worked at Sears for over 30 years and was leading the charge in getting America's biggest manufacturer and retailer into plastics. You probably never even wondered who designed, or maybe if anyone ever designed, the blow-molded plastic trash can. Charles Harrison did in 1966. It sold for $6. This was an affordable, durable, lightweight solution to metal trash cans that the trashmen would throw on the sidewalk at 5 in the morning, waking everybody up. So it's another example of our behavior changing because of plastic, but in this case, for the better. We could sleep past 5 a.m. on a Monday because Charles Harrison's plastic trash cans. I've become a teeny bit obsessed with Charles Harrison. He just passed away 2 years ago, but before doing so, he wrote a pretty lovely memoir called A Life's Design of his experience trying to get a job in industrial design as an African American in the 40s and 50s, and then ultimately triumphing and staying at Sears for over 30 years, completely single-handedly transforming their output, and as a result, what Americans consumed. So that's just my little mini book review on the side. It's a first-person narrative of a designer's experience. If we're looking at utilitarian objects and how plastic transformed them, there is probably, sadly, no better example than the plastic bag. Interestingly, the plastic bag was invented to save the environment by providing a reusable, durable option to paper bags, which were creating deforestation because they were made of wood pulp. Swedish designer Sten Gustaf Thulin designed the plastic bag for Celloplast, a Swedish company, which patented the bag in 1962. As soon as it became obvious that they would be useful, other manufacturers got involved trying to upend this patent, and Mobil wound up overturning the patent in the United States, probably just because they had better lawyers, and that allowed them to enter the plastic bag market. And once Mobil starts making plastic bags, you better believe that they're going to be used everywhere. It was difficult at first to get people to adopt these bags, and they started entering supermarkets in 1977. But it wasn't until the mid-1980s that they really took off. By 1985, 1,000 plastic bags cost $24, and 1,000 paper bags cost $30. You might not think $5 is a huge savings, but if you multiply that by the number of bags a store had to give out, it's substantial. I think it's really telling that we didn't know what to do with these bags, because this example from around 1979 is actually printed with instructions to help you understand what you might use this thing for. We had no idea why we would need them. But you can see the instructions say it's easier to carry with soft strap handles, it's stronger than paper, it has multiple uses, it's great for school books, it's ideal for beach parties and picnics, you could use it as a knitting or sewing bag, and it makes a great liner for small garbage cans. It's also moisture proof. You're all laughing at that right now, I'm laughing at that right now, but we had no idea why we would need this thing. Now we're on the other side of that problem, where we don't understand how we could live without them. So it's another great example of the behavior that plastic enabled being the real change. Plastic allowed the birth of what was at the time a completely new culture, a disposable one. McDonald's installed the first drive-thru in 1975 in Sierra Vista, Arizona. There's a pub quiz winner for you. And by 1981, McDonald's was producing 600 tons of non-destructible plastic food wrappings every year. They sold 50 billion burgers by 1984. And at some point in the middle of that, they introduced the polystyrene molded, non-recyclable, non-renewable, non-biodegradable hamburger clamshell. The Smithsonian, which owns the one on the lower left, says that it was 1968, but then later says that it was made in 1975. So it's unclear to me if it was introduced in 68 and that version was made in 75. The Smithsonian, sadly, has proven itself to be a little less concerned with accuracy and dates than I would like. But at some point in there, all of those 50 billion burgers went from being wrapped in paper to being wrapped in plastic coffins. And at the beginning, I suggested seeing the Keep America Beautiful TV ad. It may seem inconceivable to you when you see this ad to imagine that we really did just throw garbage out car windows. It just seems over-dramatized. In truth, that's what everyone did. You ate your McDonald's in the car, and whatever distance it took to finish your meal from the drive-thru, you would just roll the window down and chuck it out. Even when we learned not to do that and put our trash in a trash receptacle, it didn't solve the problem because that trash has continued to find its way into the environment. Normally in class we would have a presentation on the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is now actually the Great Pacific Garbage Patches, and learn a little bit more about plastics in the ocean. But even without that, we all know where this culture of disposability has led. It led to today. We have garbage not only in the oceans, but everywhere else. There are plastics in many forms: complete containers, small bits, microparticles, floating around in the ocean. There's a chemical sludge and a debris that the gyres, the tidal motions of the oceans, pool into areas, creating a major environmental crisis. And we saw this coming, but our behavior was so completely altered by convenience that it became sort of unstoppable. And if the youth of today think this is a problem thrust upon them by the older people, they're sadly mistaken, because after every single class, I go through the trash can in the back of the room and pick out all the things that could have been put in the recycling bin if anybody cared. The recycling bin, for anyone who's not part of our class, is right next to the trash can. And if you miss that one, there's another one right outside the door. And don't get me started on single-serving potato chip packaging with its aluminumized polypropylene chip bags that can't be recycled. Anyway, the point is, we were aware of the problem with petrochemical and plastic use, and there was a reaction even at the very beginning of this era. Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring was published in 1962. She was disturbed by post-World War II synthetic chemical pesticide use, and she warned the public about the long-term effects of misusing pesticides. Silent Spring challenged the practices of agricultural scientists and the government and called for a change in the way humankind viewed the natural world. And Buckminster Fuller, whom I introduced last week, published Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth in 1968. In it, he relates the Earth to a spaceship flying through space, a spaceship with a finite amount of resources that can't be resupplied. And later, in 1981, he published Critical Path, which discussed moving past the scarcity of resources, food especially, and global politics to get at a world where everybody can share equally. Also in the late 60s, we had the opportunity to consider our planet from a different point of view because of the photographs that came back from the Apollo missions. Jim Lovett, the astronaut who took the famous picture we call Earthrise, said the vast loneliness is awe-inspiring and makes you realize just what you have back there on Earth. He was taking pictures out of the porthole, and when he saw the Earth rising over the horizon of the moon on Christmas Eve of 1968, he quickly swapped the film out and captured the color image. As a result of this new awareness of not only the problems of plastics, but the preciousness of our planet, the first Earth Day was organized on April 22nd in 1970, and the posters for this are so moving and powerful, and the images that came out of it were equally inspiring to help the first wave of the environmental movement really get going. We developed a widespread understanding of how alone we are on this planet, which we started to call the Big Blue Marble, because of this very famous photograph. Since its arrival in our lives in 1972, this photograph was the most reproduced photograph ever taken. I am desperately hoping that is still true, because this picture is meaningful and important. And if Kim Kardashian's lip pouting rear end sticking out presence on Instagram has upended that, we've really lost something that matters. This picture was taken with a handheld Hasselblad camera out the porthole on the Apollo 17 spaceship. And if you remember all the way back to Raymond Loewy's work with NASA, I pointed out that his presence as the habitability advisor for that project insisted that there be a porthole. He was determined that people in this little tin can going out into space on our behalf should be allowed a view of where they had come from, to keep it in mind. So as a result of that porthole, we got this photograph. And I know this is turning into a boring history class, but it all relates to design, I promise. A few other things that forced our focus on the environment and how much it matters relate to nuclear power. The Cuban Missile Crisis on October of 1962 saw us narrowly avoiding a nuclear conflict. In 1979, 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania had a major meltdown. It was the first time we had a nuclear accident that we were all aware of. And then Chernobyl happened in 1986. So in relatively short order, we had a number of incidences that showed us that nuclear power might not be the solution that we thought it was. We also saw two major global oil crises, one in 1973 and one in 1979. And this affects plastics because they're made from the same petrochemicals, petroleum. It's the base for not only gasoline, but also plastic polymers. We saw ourselves with a rationing system that was the first one since World War II. We had to get gasoline based on our license plate, even day and odd day. There were flag systems to indicate availability. People would wait in line for hours to fill their cars up. Schools and offices closed to save heating oil. And to reduce consumption, a national speed limit was set at 55 miles an hour. We also did experiments with daylight savings time, which are too complicated for me to even understand. But daylight savings time, which had been around in a spotty sort of way for a long time, was made regular in this time. So this affected design in a major way. All of the fuel-consuming objects that we used, anything with an internal combustion engine, had to be reconsidered. Gas prices had increased 50%. US automakers suddenly found themselves completely unable to sell the huge V8 gas guzzlers they had been making for decades. And they had major financial problems. The fuel-efficient Japanese cars, on the other hand, took off. Matthew's second favorite car after the Isetta is the 1974 Civic, and as you can see in the ad, happiness is 32 miles to the gallon. The Civic is the perfect antidote to the gasoline shortage and runaway prices, the two most pressing problems with which we have to deal in 1974 and the years ahead. Everything in this ad is talking about why this car solves the problems that American manufacturers were struggling with. Because the Japanese compact cars got more than 30 miles to the gallon, Toyota and Honda became major US auto distributors, really upending a very long tradition of American automobile manufacturing. And the Datsun ads from this time period are so wonderful in the way they took on this conversation. Volkswagen was on board as well, and as a result, their sales dramatically increased in the United States. We saw a complete change in what we thought a car should look like. They became almost overnight smaller, less expensive, lighter, and I would argue more European in their approach. These look almost like Italian plastic radios. So that's the end of this crazy narrative. Plastic offered many layers of challenge to designers. The struggle to figure out how to use it was counterbalanced by all of the new opportunities that it also afforded. Sadly, that proved more complicated than we could ever have predicted, and now we need to figure out how to reverse engineer some of those decisions and rebalance the equation. Another chapter from this week is the history of the single material, single manufacturing process chair, the plastic chair, which I pulled out. It belongs in the middle of this conversation, but it can stand on its own well enough that I took it out so that you'd have shorter videos to watch. So check that out too. Next week is the last week, week 12 in this 12-week investigation, and we're going to look at computers. We're going to look at computers as new technology, we're going to look at computers as objects that require design, and we're going to look at how computers introduced a whole new sort of thinking about interface and system design. We're also then going to look at how computers are used as design tools, allowing unprecedented and unimaginable forms. And then the third component of next week's content is how Memphis design ushered in the age of impractical products, flipping the bird at the design world, making a statement that marketing matters more than anything we previously considered as good design. and how that effort opened the door to our own age of celebrity designers, where form is no longer a product of function, but of celebrity. We don't even care if something does its job well as long as it looks a certain way. In fact, we might not even care what it does. In fact, it might not even do anything. So we'll get that chapter in next week as well. See you then. This time I brought a drink with me. The more you know. Swedish? Swedish? Is Sten Swedish? I think Sten is Swedish. Swedish? Swedish. Okay. She was disturbed by post-World War II synthetical... synthetical?